Okay, so if there's no more questions on that issue, let's move to the second issue. The second issue then is to do with al-qadr, the good and the evil. So how can you say there's evil in the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Okay, to explain this point, then some of this stuff is a bit technical because there's Arabic terms. Ash-shar laysa fil qada walakin fil maqdi. Right? That evil, when we speak of evil, it is not in Allah's decree, but it is in what Allah has decreed. Right? So I know this is going to be a bit hard to distinguish in your mind. So I want to give you an example. So let's say shaitan, for example. Shaitan, the devil. Right? Shaitan is evil. Shaitan is from the creation of Allah. Right? Shaitan is from the decree of Allah. Right? Allah decreed for there to be shaitan. Allah decreed for there for there to be Iblis and shaitan. So he's evil, but in the act of Allah, in Allah's action of creating shaitan, is there evil? Right? So can you make that distinction between those two things? Right? There is the action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in creating shaitan, and there's Allah decreeing shaitan to be. Is there any evil in Allah's act of decreeing and creating? The answer is no. Right? So this is Allah's qadr. This is Allah creating. This is Allah's action now, right? Is there any evil in that? The answer is no. And that's because in everything Allah does, in everything Allah creates, there is a wisdom, there is a benefit, there is a goodness, like an eventual goodness, right? So there's nothing in the decree of Allah, whatever Allah has decreed, that is evil. There's nothing in the qadr of Allah in which there is evil. However, in what Allah, in the thing being decreed, in the thing which is maqdur, and the thing which is maqdi, right? So the thing created, the thing decreed, right? In that thing, there can be evil, right? From one angle, from an angle, right? So if you can distinguish that in your mind, if you distinguish between Allah's act of creating and Him decreeing, we can never ever say there's no evil in any of that, right? So whether it is Allah creating shaitan, Allah creating pain, for example, or suffering, for example, or illness, for example, or death, for example, or poverty, for example, right? In all of these things, in relation to us, these are evils in relation to us. Why? Because we feel pain, we feel suffering, we feel physical harm, we don't like these things, it's evil for us. So this is evil in that sense. But in Allah creating these things and decreeing these things, there is no evil at all. Rather, there is far-reaching wisdom. Why? Because without pain, how would we know what is pleasure? Without poverty, how would we know what is riches and affluence? Without good health, how would we know? Without illness and pain and suffering, how would we know what is good health? Right? So in Allah's act of creating all of these things and Allah decreeing these things, there is only goodness and perfect wisdom, right? And that's why we see in a supplication that al-khair wal-khair kulluhu biyadayk, right? Goodness, all of it is in your hands. All of goodness is in your hands. وَالشَّرُّ لَيْسَ إِلَيْكَ. And the evil is not ascribed to you. Is not ascribed to you. Right? So we cannot ever ascribe evil to Allah, even though evil exists in His creation. Right? So you need to make that distinction clearly in your mind. Evil can never be ascribed to Allah in the sense that is there anything in the decree of Allah, what He decrees, His act of decreeing, His act of creating, is there anything in those actions which is evil? No. There can never be any evil in the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But in what is created, in what is decreed, there can be evil, but it's only evil in relation to us, right? So we see pain and suffering as an evil. We see, we see shaitan and the shayateen to be evil, and indeed they are evil. But there's also wisdom and goodness in the sense that through shaitan and through the shayateen, the people of Iman are distinguished between the people of kufr, and it is the way by which Allah tests and puts people to trial. So there are wisdoms in what Allah has created, right? So therefore we cannot ascribe to the act of Allah evil, but evil is found within the creation. The Shaykh goes on to give some examples that even the evil that occurs in this creation, it is not actually absolute evil, right? This is not absolute evil. Rather, there is actually some benefit as well. So he gives the example. He says, for example, when we see other people who are suffering, for example, for their sins, and you will now take an admonition, right? You take an admonition, you take a lesson, you keep away from the things that individual has been doing, right? Maybe someone is gambling, maybe someone is fornicating, maybe someone is stealing and cheating, right? So they get caught, or they face humiliation, or they get punished, or whatever. So you now take that as, this is a decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are evils. But now this benefits you in the sense that you now take an admonition from these things, and you inhibit yourself from these sins, right? And similarly, there are many things from Allah's decree, as the Messenger said, "Ma yusibul Muslim min nasabin wala wasabin wala hammin wala huznin wala adhan wala gham hatta shawka yushakuha illa kaffar Allahu biha min khatayah." There is nothing which afflicts a Muslim of any kind of, poverty, any kind of hardship or pain or suffering or anxiety or sadness or harm or kind of gloominess or anything like that, until even when he's pricked by a thorn, except that Allah expiates of his sins by way of that, right? So even though these things are evils in relation to us, they are evil from an angle in the sense that they are painful, we don't like them, but nevertheless there is some khair, which is the expiation of sins. So this means that in Allah creating these things, right? So you have like prickly thorns and things like that, and you have anxiety and grief and sadness and all sorts of things that harm you physically or mentally or emotionally or whatever, and the believer undergoes these things. In Allah creating those things, there is no evil. Rather, there is perfect wisdom, and in fact there is mercy, because through these things the believer is washed and cleaned and purified of his sins and of his shortcomings. So they are actual goodness, and there is wisdom in their creation, and this is nothing but khair, goodness, as it relates to Allah's decreeing of these things and creating these things. But in relation to us, they are evil from one angle, from an angle, not evil in the absolute sense, right? So the Shaykh then goes on to give another example, he says, and he explains that, look, these things are expiation of sins, and when a calamity befalls you, like an illness or something, your sin is removed, but when you have patience, you then earn a good deed on top of the sin being removed. Right? So here is the wisdom in all of this, right? So, physically you are stung, or there's a nettle or something, and it's irritating, for days or something. Okay, that's now the physical pain and whatever. This is sins being removed. But if you now have patience, you have sabr, and you don't complain, you don't become angry, and you have sabr, this now is an additional good deed on top of that, right? For which you are rewarded. So, all of these things which we perceive to be evil, illness, death, poverty, hunger, whatever, yes, they are evil from an angle, but they are beneficial from another angle. And in Allah creating those things, there is goodness and there is wisdom, which is why evil can never approach Allah. Evil can never be ascribed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Shaykh goes on to give the example of al-marad, مثال ذلك المرض. So from the angle of a man, what does an illness do? An illness, gives him pain. He stops him from doing his beneficial interests, like working and things like that. And he will consider it to be an evil. But from the angle that when a person falls ill, he realizes how weak he is as a person, and how easy he can succumb to illness and die, right? He will now recognize the favor and the bounty of Allah upon him. He will recognize the favor of good health, the bounty of good health, and he will realize that this is an expiation for his sins, and it will raise his ranks if he has patience. Then all of these things now prove that what was decreed for him was actually goodness, not evil, right? And that's why we now go back to that hadith that we mentioned, right? Indeed, the affair of the believer in all of it is khair, is goodness, right? If something pleasing comes to him, he is grateful, and that is better for him. And if something harmful afflicts him and comes to him, then he has patience, and that is better for him. And this is not for anyone other than the believer, right? So all of the affair of the believer, therefore, is goodness, because he knows that nothing from the decree of Allah is actually evil, like absolute evil for him. Rather, all of it is goodness, because everything, every calamity, every hardship, every pain, every suffering, every grief, anxiety, it's simply a means for him to become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to distinguish between al-qadar and al-maqdur, right? What's the difference? Al-qadar is Allah's act of decreeing things and creating things, right? Good or evil in relation to us, right? So we have to distinguish between that and between the maqdur, the thing created, right? In which there can be good and there can be evil. And the qada and the maqdi, right? The thing determined, Allah's action of determining, and the thing determined. We make a distinction between these things. So, as far as the thing decreed and the thing created, then it can be evil. As Allah Azza wa Jal, He says in the Quran, وَنَبْلُوَكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً وَإِلَيْنَا تُرْجَعُونَ. That we shall put you to trial by way of evil and by way of goodness as a tribulation, and to us shall you be returned. So here Allah said, put to trial by way of evil. So there is evil, but it's in this creation, and by way of goodness, right? So evil and goodness are in the creation. That's why we say al-qadar khayruhu wa sharruhu. Al-qadar is good and it's evil, meaning the thing being decreed, not the action of Allah in decreeing it. And after this, the Shaykh goes on to say, after he discusses this and makes that clear, he then goes on to say that when we look at the people people are of four levels when it comes to the things which are decreed, right? So, in relation to the things which are decreed to happen, first of all, we have been ordered to be pleased with those things. This is mustahab, to be pleased. To have patience is wajib, and to become angry against those things is haram, and to be grateful is actually the highest level, right? So basically there are four responses or four positions that we can have towards the things which are decreed in Allah's creation, right? There are four things. You can either be pleased, which is something which is mustahab. So for example, you suffer some pain, you have an illness, you are pleased with that, right? This is desirable. Or you can have patience, and you can have patience. To have sabr is actually something which is wajib in the Sharia. To be patient with all hardships and calamities. To become angry, you became angry that you suffered poverty or suffered pain. To have anger, this now is unlawful. It's haram to actually have that anger. And as for being grateful, having shukr, this is something that is the highest rank or the highest degree, the best believer. And so the Shaykh says, therefore, in light of this, when we look at all the people, all the Muslims in relation to the things which are decreed upon them, we find that they are divided into four categories. There are four levels of people. The first level is, the Shaykh says, a person becomes angry, an yakuna sakhitan, right? He becomes angry that this hardship or this calamity has come. And in relation to this, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu, he said, la'ana Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam an-na'iha wal-mustami'ah. Right? Allah has cursed the woman who wails over the dead. When you start wailing, you start screaming and shouting and, going overboard. Wal-mustami'ah. And the one who is there listening to this woman and encouraging her and participating in the, you see women do this, right? Someone dies in the family, they get together. One woman loses her mind, starts screaming, shouting, crying, wailing, slapping herself, and then the others start, doing the same thing. These women are cursed, right? These women are cursed. They are, being cursed means that you are made far, far away from Allah's mercy. This is the meaning of being cursed. So, this is a display of anger towards Allah's decree. Someone passed away, it was Allah's decree. You're not showing any patience, right? This is you are anger against Allah's decree. So this now is prohibited. It's prohibited, and Allah cursed this type of thing. In this particular example, to do with death, meaning wailing. The second type of person, or the second level, an yakuna sabiran, is that instead of becoming angry, you accept it and you are patient. So you are now patient. And أن يتحمل المصيبة ويتصبر مع الكراهية لكنه لا يغضب على الله فهذا صابر والصبر واجب. Right, so this person now is patient, and even though he dislikes the calamity, this is natural. You don't like that someone has died. You don't like that you have harm, like an illness that's hard to bear. You don't like poverty, loss of wealth, loss of riches, because it's hard to bear. You don't like that. Yes. You're not forced to, but you are patient nevertheless. Still, you are patient, you show patience, you don't complain, So here, it is wajib to show patience, right? Meaning not to become angry, not to express this anger verbally, right? This is not the same as disliking the calamity. Yes, you can dislike the calamity, because this is natural. But anger, not becoming angry, this is what is unlawful. So you have to distinguish between anger towards the thing happening and dislike of the thing happening, right? Now the third type of person is the one, as the Shaykh says, an yakuna radiyan. that there's a third type of person who's actually happy and satisfied with the thing that happened, meaning that he doesn't have hatred or dislike of what happened like we have in the second level. Here the person now is actually happy, right? So it could be an illness, could be loss of wealth, could be some pain inflicted, maybe it could be a bite or a sting or something like that, it could be a death even. So he thinks about it, and obviously he's showing patience, and instead of disliking the thing that happened, he actually likes the thing that happened. He's pleased and he's satisfied and he's happy because he can see the benefit to him and his well-being in this life and the next. So it could be, for example, a person maybe has lost some wealth. Okay, so then he thinks about it, he thinks, well, if I had that wealth, I would have squandered it maybe on unlawful things. I may have been put to trial by way of that wealth. I may have done things which are haram with that wealth. So in a way, I'm happy that happened, and now I'll move on and, whatever, right? So here now the person actually has pleasure. He's pleased with the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This now is the third level, that you are pleased with the decree of Allah after having patience and obviously not becoming angry, right? The fourth level goes beyond that, and here this is when a person an yakuna shakiran. He's actually not just pleased, he's actually grateful. He's actually grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that calamity. أن يكون شاكرا أي مع الصبر والرضا. So on top of being pleased with that decree and having sabr, right, he is also in fact grateful to Allah. فيزداد ثناء على الله ويحمده على هذه المصيبة. And so he praises Allah, he thanks Allah, he's grateful to Allah. This is the highest level, right? He's actually grateful for that calamity, right? Some people, they go through a calamity and they realize and they think, this is a wake-up call for me. It could be a death in the family, it could be some illness, it could be some loss of wealth, it could be something, and he thinks, this has really opened my eyes. I have to be grateful to Allah that Allah, through this calamity, Allah has shown me the reality of this life, of the world, that this world is just really nothing, and it wakes people up. So they are truly grateful to Allah that they have been made to suffer this particular calamity. So they go beyond the level of sabr, beyond the level of ar-rida, of being pleased, and they are actually grateful to Allah for this. So this brings us to the end of the second point. So what we are doing here is, in the flow of the discussion, we finished discussing the asbab, the material and the physical causes and their effects. We discussed that issue, and how all of that is part and parcel of al-qadr. It's not outside of al-qadr. By extension, man and his actions are exactly the same, right? Man and his actions are exactly the same. Just like Allah created physical essences and gave them their properties, in the same way Allah created man and gave him his qualities and his attributes. He made man to be one who wills and one who acts, alongside other things. فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. We made man to be hearing and seeing. Allah made man to be hearing and seeing and knowing and willing and acting. Allah made man to be like this. All of that is within al-qadr. It's part and parcel of al-qadr, right? So man is neither forced to do his actions, nor does he do his actions outside of the will and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is within Allah's will and power. He's within al-qadr. He does not go outside of al-qadr, right? So we cleared that point. Then the second point we are discussing now in today's lesson is the issue of good and evil, right? So how do we explain the issue of evil? And the answer to this is that in Allah's action of decreeing everything, there is no evil whatsoever. All of it is wisdom, because in all of Allah's actions, what He wills, what He decrees, what He brings to be, there is nothing but wisdom and goodness, right? Until even in the creation of things that we see to be evil, in the creation of shaitan, iblis, the devil, in the creation of what we perceive to be evil, like death and pain and hunger and grief and anxiety and all those other things, the creation of those things, there is wisdom and goodness in their creation, even though in relation to us they are perceived as evil, right? So we have to make that distinction between al-qada wal-maqdi, al-qadar wal-maqdur. There's a distinction between Allah's act of willing and creating and decreeing, and between the thing decreed and willed and brought about. In fact, some of the scholars they give an example, or they give a similitude. They say, for example, there's a surgeon who needs to operate upon you, right? So the action of the surgeon in cutting you open and so on and so forth, right? As it relates to you, the recipient, that's an evil, because you are receiving what is painful, what is whatever. But in the actual action of the surgeon, his actual action, there is nothing but goodness for you, because it is life-saving for you, right? It's going to benefit your health, and it's going to save your life in some cases, right? So there's evil from one angle, but there is benefit. So in the action there's benefit, the action of the surgeon, but for you as the recipient there is evil. Right? So some scholars do give that example, but inshallah the point itself should be very, very clear. And that leads us now, there's actually a third point that we're going to discuss on this issue. And this now leads us to the issue of, okay, the argument of Al-Qadr. How do you, people who use the argument that if Allah has decreed these things, He knows these things and decreed these things, then how am I held accountable? And how am I held responsible? So some people use Allah's decree as an argument to justify their evil actions. That's the third thing that we're going to discuss, inshallah, in the next lesson. But here in today's lesson, we will suffice with the discussion of these two things, inshallah ta'ala. So keep in mind that there's an actual flow to this whole discussion, and there's a certain sequence, a certain order in which we are discussing these particular things, in which they've been arranged in this book, to help us grasp the issues, sequentially, step by step, right? So with that, we'll conclude today's lesson. If there is any questions on anything that we've discussed, feel free to ask, inshallah, before we conclude.
Can you repeat how would we understand then the statement of Rasul where he said the qadr of the good of it and the bad of it? So how do we understand what's meant by the bad of it?
How do we distinguish between the good and the bad?
Not distinguish, but how do we understand what's meant by the bad of it?
The bad of it is just like we said. So the question is, how do we know the good from the bad in relation to al-qadr? Yeah. Okay. Well, there's two things here: that which relates to the creation, that which relates to the Sharia. So, in terms of the thing decreed, we know that shirk, polytheism, kufr, disbelief, sin, disobedience, all of these things are evils. Right? They are things which take place within Allah's creation, which are actual evil. Even though in Allah's act of creating those things, as we said before, there are wisdoms, and we don't ascribe that evil to Allah's act. So those things are very, very clear. It's very simple. Whatever opposes the Sharia, then we know that to be evil, for it to take place in the creation, even though Allah allows it to take place, but that's for a wisdom. Then there are the worldly things, which we know to be evil, such as disease, death, poverty, hunger, all things which bring harm and pain and suffering physically or otherwise. Then in relation to us, they are evils. So what is the good from what is evil is very straightforward and simple. In relation to al-qadr, it is whatever opposes the sharia, that is an evil, and whatever obviously brings harm to mankind, physically, to their wealth or to their physical being or whatever, then those obviously we all agree that these are evils, right? So that's all there is to it. So that would be the shar, the evil that has been decreed within the creation. Yeah. Okay, inshallah, we'll stop there for today, and in the next lesson, as we said, we'll then start discussing the important issue of looking at the arguments people use to justify. These are sinful Muslims who will justify their actions by saying, well, Allah decreed it upon me, Allah decreed this sin upon me, what can I do? So we look at that in some detail, inshallah. We will look at the arguments used and how they have been refuted in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and also by way of reason. So that will be for the next lesson, and so we'll conclude today's lesson there. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.